and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, earlier today, I spoke to Professor Khaled Beydoun for AWANI Global. Khaled Beydoun has been named one of the 500 most influential Muslims of the world. He is a law professor and the author of the critically acclaimed book, American Islamophobia, Understanding the Roots and Rise of Fear, which examines the social, legal, and political dimensions that have fueled anti-Muslim sentiments in the United States. He has a new book out called The New Crusades, Islamophobia and the Global War on Muslims. It studies Islamophobia as a global phenomenon, and he's on the show to discuss this issue. Here's my conversation with him. Welcome, Professor Beydoun, to AWANI. It's good to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Now, I want to start on a solemn note and remember that we are coming up to 1 year of the genocide in Gaza. And I think it's important that we assess how perceptions and policies and activism has changed and evolved in this past year. And let's start there. Maybe you can tell me, based on your assessment, how you think the year, how the world might have changed in the past year. How has it evolved in terms of public sentiment and in terms of political action?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here with you today to have this conversation. So in 10 days, I believe it is, will mark the 1 year anniversary of the genocide in Gaza. And it's been a whirlwind of a year. The world has changed in transformative ways, in a range of ways. I think for me, the most sort of salient way the world has changed is we're seeing a global upswell of support for the people of Gaza. We're seeing real momentum for self-determination and sovereignty for the Palestinian people. We're seeing how my country, the United States, is very much a pariah nation in conjunction with Israel in being the two lone nations that are supporting a genocide, which in many respects is changing how people on this side of the world view the United States, but the West at large, claiming to be bastions and spearheads of civilization. But this issue, the genocide in Gaza, has really demystified and pierced that as being a myth.
Well, I know that I have been personally changed in this past year, but how has the year changed you?
In a series of ways. I think intellectually, personally, during the first week of the genocide, I lost a very close friend of mine who was a journalist based out of Lebanon during an assassination on a journalistic colleague of yours. I have many family friends in Gaza, family now in Lebanon. And as you know, the Lebanese situation has spiraled into full-fledged war in the last several days. So it's been a year, but to be honest with you, it's felt more like 5 years. I can't recall the world in many respects before the beginning of this genocide. And even these last several days when touching down here in Malaysia, I've been on the phone around the clock, touching base with friends in Lebanon, with family in Lebanon, seeing what kind of needs they have on the ground. So it's been a very challenging year, existentially, intellectually, in almost every way.
Has it changed at all? I mean, in terms of the intensity, the urgency, the support that you talked about a bit earlier, has it changed? I'm asking because I wonder whether there's been kind of attention fatigue from the rest of the world, or has it been the opposite? Has there been now more urgency and more outrage?
It's hard to gauge. I would say that it's very fluid and it's very turbulent. I would say during the first 4 months of the genocide, there was considerable global, upswing in attention across the board. Then there was some fatigue set in. But now, whenever there's a real, bloody incident, a massacre, now that war is reemerging in Lebanon, we're seeing a return and revitalization of energy, which is a great thing because it's energy that is categorically, almost it feels like, opposition to what Israel is doing, opposition to the fact that the United States is funding, enabling, weaponizing this genocide. So I think if we were to focus on one positive outcome of what's happened in the last year is that the degree of grassroots opposition, globally speaking, is very much at an unprecedented level. But also literacy. I think that the lay person on the ground, the lay woman on the street, understands this crisis in ways that they hadn't a year before.
Oh, that's so interesting. What makes you say that? Because the current war in Gaza has often been portrayed or framed into religious terms or ethnic terms or racial terms. How do you think that this framing distorts the way that people understand, but also the real issues at play.
Yeah. No, it's a good observation. I think it's been part of the Israeli agenda, I think, to frame this as a religious war, a clash of civilizations, which, you know, is language that is adopted from the American War on Terror. The fact that Islam is at war with Christianity and Judaism is somehow aligned with Christianity. And people have realized that this is basically a secular war that's using and exploiting religion for the purposes of ethnic cleansing and genocide. One classic example that really resonates in my head is there was a shooting and there was a sniping of Christian Palestinians in Gaza, in the neighborhood of Zaytun, right? And people were seeing that during the thick of Christmas in the West, that Palestinian Christians were being killed by Israelis, right? And that demystified the idea that this was a Jewish government going specifically after Muslims. They were killing Christians the same way. Israeli bombs, Israeli bullets can't distinguish between Christians and Muslims in Palestine. They're killing them because they are Palestinian.
So how does, because your work is so rooted in the study of Islamophobia, how do you see Islamophobia contributing to an anti-Palestinian sentiment? And I ask this particularly within kind of Western political discourse and also in the media.
Great question, right? So when we think about Islamophobia in the modern context, it's critical to understand it as a sort of a tentacle of the broader war on terror. And the war on terror has been championed and spearheaded by the United States since the 9/11 terror attacks. And the war on terror really capitalizes on considerable Western ignorance about who Arabs are, Middle Eastern people are, who Muslims are, right? In many respects, Islamophobia conflates and confuses Arab, Muslim, and Middle Eastern as being one entity. So when the American viewer or the Western viewer views a Palestinian, you know, even a Palestinian Christian, they don't view them as being legitimate Christians. They view them as being Muslims as a consequence of being Arabs, right? So this is how the anti-Palestinian sentiment that is unfolding right now and how Israel is really weaponizing a war on terror law and logic to basically construct the Palestinian people almost as a monolithic block of Muslims, right? Not distinguishing between the religious identity. This is also true for Lebanon, right? A couple of days ago, a Christian church was bombed in the south of Lebanon. So they intentionally confuse and obfuscate the distinctions along religious lines in both Palestine and Lebanon to continue this myth. It's a lie, right? It's a grand narrative that is based on stereotypes and distortions, that there are no people aside from Muslims in these countries.
For the U.S., let's take the U.S. context, is that the root of Islamophobia, the war on terror?
Yeah. It's the modern roots,
okay.
Right? So the modern roots of how we understand Islamophobia in the contemporary context is the war on terror, right? It was weaponized by the Bush administration, then subsequently the Obama administration, but it also has long-standing venerable precedents, right? So Palestinian scholar Edward Said talked about this idea of Orientalism, that the West saw itself in mirror opposite terms of the East, and the East was the Muslim world. And this very much roots and seeds the stereotypes that the Muslim world is perpetually at war, the Muslim world is backwards, the Muslim world is uncivilized, right? Modern Islamophobia essentially redeploys these stereotypes that have existed for a long time that come from the Crusades, right? We all understand the Crusades grand narrative. So there's very much an underbelly of stereotypes that is rooted for centuries that are redeployed and readapted in the modern context.
Is that the basis of the title of the new book?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So talk to me about how this plays out in daily life, in lived realities. We have the kind of textbook definition of Islamophobia.
Yeah.
But for people who live it, what does it look like?
Well, in the book, you know, I frame Islamophobia in ways that are distinct from how people understand it on a day-to-day basis. Oh. You know, if you were to ask somebody on the street here in Kuala Lumpur or New York City, please define Islamophobia for me, they're going to tell you it's bigotry, it's bias, it's hate violence, it's hate crimes, right? But it's more than that. And I think the most focal and destructive aspect of Islamophobia is policy, it's state law, right? So in the United States, examples of Islamophobia that your audiences may be aware of are the Muslim ban that was enacted by Trump, right? Or counter-radicalization surveillance that was dividing and surveilling Muslim communities in the United States. The Patriot Act, which enabled the freezing of banks, the deportation of individuals suspected of terrorism, and broad surveillance and spying on Muslim communities. So the law and policy of Islamophobia that has been mainstreamed in the United States is very, very nefarious, but it also emboldens private citizens to act as vigilantes attacking Muslims. You guys have a dramatically different experience that Malaysia is a Muslim majority country. In the United States, we're a religious minority that are singled out as prospective terrorists as a consequence being vulnerable to both law and policy, but also private hate violence.
And how does the media, the Western media, mainstream media,
Yeah.
perpetuate this perception?
So historically, very destructively, right? There's been a change and a positive change in some respects that I can circle back to, but in the United States, mainstream media is corporate media. It is advanced by specific biases and perspectives, which are generally aligned with the Zionist objective, Israeli interests, or conservative interests in the United States. So Western media, news media, is perpetually only talking about Muslims in relation to national security, in relation to war, in relation to terrorism. The mass majority of Americans, when they view Muslims on television, it is specifically through this lens of terrorism, even in film, in popular cinema, and in popular film. Social media has changed that in positive ways recently.
Okay, talk to me more about that, because
Yeah.
your advocacy has reached audiences beyond the US through social media.
Yeah.
But how has social media, both in the pros and cons, shaped the way people perceive Muslims, people perceive Islam, people perceive the Palestinian cause for liberation? Are these platforms, in your view, do they do more harm or good? How do we think through the trade-offs?
Yeah, I think they do more good, frankly speaking, when you do a general accounting. I mean, you're a journalist, you've heard of this term, citizen journalism, right? The idea that, private individuals like myself or students or activists on the ground can build a social media platform to basically convey a more authentic, organic narrative of who they are as Muslims. I mean, if we look at the past year, the fact that we have individuals on the ground like Bassam Auda in Gaza, like Mu'taz Azaiza, like Wael Dahdouh. These are real Palestinians that the CNNs, the BBCs, the Foxes, the Sky News of the world never shows. They never show Palestinian faces. They never show Palestinian stories. They never talk about Palestinian authentic first-hand narratives. The only time they talk about Palestinians when Palestinians are attacking Israelis, when they're the bad guys. So social media, digital media specifically, has humanized Palestinians in a way that is unprecedented.
And do you still see harmful narratives on social media? How do you go about countering those narratives that will just further Islamophobia?
Yeah. No, so social media clearly isn't perfect, and there's a range of perils, there's a range of hazards. Big tech obviously generally leans more toward the side of Israel, so we've all heard stories of censorship.
The
shadow banning. My page is heavily shadow banned. I get posts removed all the time. But also misinformation, right? The fact that social media becomes a conduit, an engine for misinformation. Individuals who are spewing state-sponsored propaganda. It's a lot easier to disseminate by social media. States, governments like the United States, like Israel, like Russia, basically farm considerable bots to push their agenda. States can shut down digital media in their own countries. We've seen that happen in Palestine and in Gaza. We've seen it happen in China, for instance, and other places around the world. So social media comes with its own set of unique challenges as well.
Okay, so I want to ask you, just personal experience and the people around you, where are you getting your information? If in the US you have this really this narrative that's being pushed by mainstream media, and social media is it's noisy, let's just say.
Very noisy.
Where do you get your information that you feel that you can trust and is truthful?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great adjective, to call it noisy and crowded. So it's very difficult to single out and parse out which information is authentic and which information is verified. For me, being a researcher, I'm a law professor, so I spend a lot of my time researching. Much of my sources on what's happening in Gaza come from individuals on the ground, individuals that I've built relationships with over many years, individuals who are first-hand accountants, first-hand victims of what's happening on the ground. A lot of the early information that I was able to pull at the beginning of the genocide came from these individuals. Outlets like Al Jazeera, right? Al Jazeera has been the only journalistic media entity on the ground in Gaza, so they've been very important also in providing much of the information. Now that we're in war in Lebanon, I have many relationships and contacts on the ground in Lebanon, so I go directly to the source to find out what's happening, to find out if the statistics of individuals that are killed or injured is accurate. For instance, now, with the philanthropic and humanitarian need, what are the greatest needs on the ground? So for me, as much as possible, because people know who I am and know that I really care about these issues, they feel comfortable sharing this information to me directly.
Can you tell us something that is not out there that you think that we should know but isn't really publicly highlighted?
Oh yeah, there's so much. I mean, so one story that really shook me, my father is originally from a South Lebanese village called Bint Jbel. I believe it was yesterday, there was a funeral procession in that town where they were mourning some of the individuals killed, and Israel bombed the funeral procession. So individuals that were attending a funeral were slain. That story was not at all addressed by the mainstream media, but it was a story that I was aware of because I had individual family friends on the ground. So there's been so many stories like that have been shared to me that mainstream or legacy media will not address, because it might conflict with a specific narrative, or because they may not have those relationships on the ground.
The access to those relationships, which is, I think, because you have that access, you've been very successful in using that information and creating grassroots movements, mobilizing communities with this information. And I want to ask you how you get from mobilizing communities and grassroots activism to creating tangible change, because that's what counts. And often we think about, oh, you know, my activism is not going to matter in the bigger scale of things.
Yeah.
But how do you convince people to come together and create some tangible change in today's really polarized world?
Yeah. So for me, you know, above all, I view myself as an educator, even more so than an activist, right? So I view it as my obligation to shed as much light as possible on issues that I care about, issues that I deem to be important. Many of my heroes, Malcolm X, said power is knowledge. In that, in order to move people toward the truth, or to move people toward, you know, righteousness, they have to have an accurate understanding of what's taking place. And I firmly believe, as an educator, that you have to meet people where they are. I understand that young people today are not going to read books. They're not going to read op-eds. They're not going to read academic articles, but they will read posts on Instagram. They will read posts on Twitter or X. So for me as an educator, I want to go to where people are and make sure that they understand as best as possible what's taking place on the ground.
Are you seeing a bit of a generational divide in the way information is being processed, or even perceptions and public sentiment in America?
Oh, very much so. Yeah, I think that, look, in the United States, there was a survey done recently where I believe the age range of young people from the age of 18 to 35 were generally pro-Palestinian. I think the clip was 67% of Americans at that age range were pro-Palestinian. And the age range from 36 to 55 lean more towards being sympathetic to Israel. And that, to me, the biggest variable is how they consume their news information, right? The older generation were generally relying on terrestrial media, CNN, ABC, BBC, these very compromised legacy media outlets to understand what's going on the ground. And obviously, it's all pro-Israeli. Young people aren't watching the news anymore. They're not watching CNN, right? They're looking to TikTok. They're looking to Instagram. They're looking to accounts like mine to provide them with information. And that's why there's been this really watershed shift with young people towards being more sympathetic to Palestine.
How do you think that will translate into the U.S. political dynamics?
Policy?
Yeah. And policy. And we're coming up to the elections. How big of a role does Gaza play in the November polls?
Yeah, your first question, you know, that's the big question. The United States sort of political system is heavily economic, and lobby groups which have considerable financial influence AIPAC is able to impact policy regardless of what people on the ground feel or think. Now, if popular opinion shifts the strength of AIPAC or forges a new PAC that is able to promote Palestinian interests, then that could shift. With this election, unfortunately, and I teach constitutional law for a living, I wish we had more than two viable options, right? Because with regard to Israel, I don't see a considerable distinction between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. I mean, Kamala Harris is the vice president right now, right? She's part of the Biden administration. It's key that we view her as being one of the parties that are enabling this genocide. She has not condemned it. She has not said one thing since the beginning of the war in Lebanon. So she's complicit in genocide. And Donald Trump is not much better. So this election with regard to war in the Middle East, in genocide in Gaza, is not very promising.
So what does that mean for a significant portion of the voters who who want to see action on
Yeah.
or see the genocide in Gaza end, or at least the funding of the genocide end from the US perspective. What does
Yeah.
that mean for voters who see no option in the two candidates?
That's a brilliant question. And it's an existential sort of crisis that many people, including myself as an individual, are currently experiencing, right? I think that everybody has distinct priorities, right? So, some voters, this issue may not be the focal issue. If you are, let's say, a single parent mother.
Single issue voter.
Yeah, I am a single issue voter
Okay.
this time. For me, it's all about Gaza, it's all about genocide. And Michigan is a battleground state, and that's where I vote. But I think that the way I struggle with this as a scholar is that there are some things that are greater or bigger than any single one election. And one of my objectives as a grassroots organizer is to begin to try to build a viable, long-term, sustained third-party option. And that is something that I am dedicating a lot of time and energy to at this point.
How? What is the vision?
The vision is to push people in the Green Party, other independent parties, to say that, elections are not won on election year. They're won in building, institutionalizing, entrenching an organization.
It's more than just casting your vote.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
so for those of us who are observing the US from the outside,
Yeah.
what is it that you think we should be watching as November comes, particularly if we care about the way the US has a role to play in the genocide?
Yeah, I would look for if there's any movement on the part of Kamala Harris with regard to what's happening in Gaza. And in the next couple of days, if she really calls for an end to this war in Lebanon. If she does, that might be a positive sign.
Okay. And how are you reading this escalation of violence in Lebanon?
Oh, it's very frightening. I spent 3 years of my life in Beirut during the civil war in the 1980s. So there's a personal connection where I'm clearly afraid for loved ones on the ground. And then, to be honest with you, from a sort of intellectual standpoint, I knew that the war was coming. It was just a matter of time.
What signs were you reading?
I mean, the fact that, Hezbollah has been fighting against Israel and sending missiles since the beginning of this genocide, right? They've been doing whatever they can to uplift the interests and sort of like defend the rights of people in Gaza in ways that other Arab governments have not, right? They've sort of ejected themselves from any sort of defense of the people of Gaza. And every day, I believe every day, with the exception of some of this entire genocide, Israel has also been bombing the south of Lebanon, right? Not only with airstrikes, not only with missiles, but also white phosphorus. There has been, I think, 120,000 people who have fled South Lebanese villages into the north of Beirut. So they've been anticipating and waiting for a full-scale war.
Okay, so it's been 1 year that we have seen this death and destruction, genocide, live streamed onto our phones.
Yeah.
How do you see what's coming next? I mean, none of us could have anticipated that it would have lasted this long.
Yeah.
How do you keep hope? How do you tell your grassroots movements to keep fighting?
There's a great quote from a Nigerian author, Chinua Achebe. He writes, "Until the lions have their own historians, history of the hunt will
We
always
studied
glorify
that in schools here.
the hunter." Yeah, Things Fall Apart is a brilliant book, right? So that quote really resonates with me because we have to think about crises like this beyond sort of the parameters of war and think about it in terms of, building new histories, changing our mindsets, decolonizing our mentalities, understanding that if we are to sort of empower and liberate our people who have been oppressed for so long, it comes with constructing our own stories, our own narratives, and our own histories. And we're seeing that happen in real time, and that to me is more important than issues around when the ceasefire is going to happen.
Okay.
Yep.
Professor Beydoun, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
being so candid and open and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you in this episode of AWANI Global. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening.